There was no warning, no press conference, no major news bulletin to prepare the public. The shutdown of Chevrolet's U.S. production operations didn't come with headlines or a CEO briefing. It came with silence. It began subtly, almost too quietly to be noticed. On a rainy Monday morning in early spring, Chevrolet plant workers in Michigan arrived for their usual shifts. They clocked in, only to find empty workstations and halted machinery. In Missouri, a similar scene played out. Trucks that were mid-assembly sat untouched. Conveyor belts were still. And in Arlington, Texas, home to one of the company's most historic plants, employees stood outside locked gates, confused and frustrated, staring at security guards who offered no answers. By the end of that day, whispers began spreading. At first, it was local talk radio and internal union channels. Nothing official, but as hours passed, the scale of the disruption became impossible to ignore. And then, 24 hours later, the whispers turned into reality. Chevrolet, a brand synonymous with American manufacturing, had pulled the plug on over $48 billion in domestic vehicle production, without a single public statement. Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. Now onto the video. This wasn't a one-off plant closure or temporary model pause. It was a full-scale production freeze across 5 key states: Michigan, Texas, Missouri, Ohio, and Indiana. Factories that once rolled out hundreds of thousands of Silverados, Suburbans, and Bolts per year had gone dark. And not because of a strike, shortage, or natural disaster. No, this time it was something else entirely. Internal documents leaked anonymously by a mid-level executive within General Motors confirmed the scope of the decision. The company wasn't pausing operations. It was exiting. Methodically, quietly, intentionally. For the thousands of workers impacted, this wasn't just a business decision, it was a betrayal. And yet, despite the magnitude, there was no clear explanation. Executives had already instructed HR departments to suspend new hires weeks before. Overtime was slashed. Vendor contracts were shortened. And behind closed doors, a staged withdrawal from U.S. production had been in motion for months. But why the secrecy? Why execute such a massive industrial shift without informing the public or even the workers affected? That answer wouldn't emerge until a deeper investigation exposed what General Motors didn't want anyone to know: that this move wasn't driven by weak demand or electric vehicle struggles. In fact, sales for many Chevy models had remained strong. Instead, the true driver was policy, specifically an aggressive set of tariffs issued by the U.S. government under the America First doctrine. When President Trump reimposed a 25% tariff on imported automobile parts, his administration positioned it as a patriotic push to revive domestic manufacturing. But for companies like Chevrolet, whose supply chain spanned the globe, the tariffs didn't protect. They paralyzed. Components essential to production, batteries from South Korea, semiconductors from Taiwan, wiring harnesses from Mexico, braking systems from Germany suddenly became 25% more expensive. And with razor-thin margins on high-volume models like the Silverado, even a minor cost spike could tip the balance. A 25% hike? Catastrophic. The math no longer worked. Continuing to produce certain vehicles in the U.S. would result in massive losses, hundreds of millions of dollars per year. And instead of absorbing those losses or passing them on to customers, General Motors made a cold calculation: retreat. But unlike past industry pullouts that came with public debate, this one was carried out in silence. The goal? Minimize backlash, keep investors calm, prevent protests, just cut the cord and hope no one notices until it's too late to stop. They were wrong. People noticed. What began as a few locked gates would soon turn into a political firestorm, a worker revolt, and a full-blown economic reckoning. And at the center of it all, one brand, one decision, and one silent shutdown that exposed far more than anyone expected. At first glance, the shutdown made no sense. Chevrolet wasn't bleeding money, it wasn't struggling to sell vehicles. In fact, Several of its most popular models, like the Silverado 1500, Suburban, and Blazer, were still topping sales charts across the country. The electric Bolt EV, despite challenges, was gaining attention among eco-conscious buyers. So, why would a brand so deeply embedded in the American identity suddenly pull the plug? The answer? Tariffs. Behind the scenes, executives weren't reacting to customer demand. They were scrambling to adapt to a sweeping policy change from Washington. At the heart of it, a 25% tariff imposed on all imported automobile parts and foreign assembled vehicles under the Trump administration's aggressive trade reform strategy. It was a move designed to punish offshoring and bring jobs back to the U.S. But in Chevrolet's case, it triggered the opposite effect. Modern car manufacturing is no longer a domestic affair. It's a global operation. The Silverado, arguably Chevrolet's most iconic truck, relies on parts from more than a dozen countries. Lithium-ion batteries from China and South Korea, semiconductors from Taiwan, electrical systems from Mexico, braking components from Germany, sensors and modules from Japan. No matter how American the badge, the vehicle itself is an international jigsaw puzzle. So, when the tariff was enforced, Chevrolet faced immediate, skyrocketing costs on almost every vehicle line. A leaked internal projection from GM showed that just continuing to produce the Silverado under the new tariff regime would increase per unit cost by nearly $2,400. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of trucks annually, and the company faced a potential $800 million annual loss on just one model. For the Bolt EV, the numbers were even more devastating. Its battery packs, sourced primarily from China, were suddenly subject to enormous surcharges. GM analysts concluded that either the Bolt's price would need to jump by $10,000 to remain profitable, or it would have to be discontinued altogether. This wasn't an operational hiccup. It was a financial catastrophe waiting to happen. And yet, to the average consumer, none of this was visible. Dealerships continued taking orders. Websites remained live. Sales reps kept promising availability. But behind the scenes, Chevrolet's leadership knew the math didn't work. Their choice wasn't between staying or leaving. It was between hemorrhaging money or cutting ties. The America First policy assumed companies would immediately shift production back to U.S. soil. But the assumption was flawed. Relocating a factory isn't like flipping a switch. It takes years, billions in capital investment, and complex negotiations with unions, regulators, and municipalities. Chevrolet simply didn't have the luxury of time. So, the company did what many corporations do when their margins are threatened. It folded its hand in silence. No admission, no warning, just a cold, strategic exit designed to minimize media attention while maximizing shareholder confidence. It wasn't about loyalty. It wasn't about patriotism. It was about numbers. And that brutal calculus exposed a critical flaw in America's new industrial policy. Tariffs without transition plans don't bring jobs home. They send them running. While executives calculated losses on spreadsheets and forecast shareholder reactions, the human toll played out in real time, on factory floors, in kitchen tables, and in unemployment lines across the Midwest and South. In Arlington, Texas, Robert Estrada was one of the first to arrive that morning. He had worked at the plant for 22 years, never called in sick, never left early. A trimline technician by trade, Robert had built hundreds of thousands of trucks with his hands. That morning, security handed him a sealed envelope and told him to wait. He never clocked in again. In Westville, Missouri, workers found pink slips taped to their lockers. In Michigan, the Detroit Hamtramck facility, one of Chevrolet's oldest sites, shut down with just 48 hours' notice. The scale of the impact was staggering. Over 17,000 direct workers across 5 states were affected. But the shock didn't stop at the factory gates. Most employees received no explanation, no severance packages, no guaranteed return date. For single mothers like Anna Doyle in Lansing, Michigan, the shutdown meant immediate chaos. "I was told to go home and wait for a call," she said in a local news interview, "but the call never came. Then my supervisor texted me and told me I should start looking for other work." Anna had been with General Motors for over a decade. Her health insurance vanished with her job badge. Her kids lost access to dental care overnight. It wasn't until internal union leaders leaked a series of HR memos that the real picture emerged. GM had been planning this for months. The company had halted new hires, shortened vendor contracts, and quietly reduced overtime, all while publicly promising stability. Local mayors, union reps, even GM's own mid-level managers were left in the dark. "We weren't just laid off," one technician in Missouri said. "We were cut out. No warning, no respect." And that's what made the wound deeper. It wasn't just the job losses, it was the deliberate secrecy that accompanied them. Workers weren't furloughed, they were ghosted. This wasn't just poor communication, it was strategic silence. Executives feared backlash, protests, and negative press. They believed a quiet exit would spare them the political fallout, but they underestimated the workers they left behind. For decades, towns like Flint, Janesville, and Toledo had built their identity around the Chevrolet brand. Multiple generations worked side by side on the line. Family legacies were forged in these plants. Losing a job wasn't just financial, it was cultural erasure. And in those final moments, as workers packed up their lockers and stepped into an uncertain future, one emotion resonated more than any other: betrayal. Not just by their employer, but by a system that allowed it all to happen in the shadows. By the time the dust settled and the headlines finally caught up to reality, the damage was already done. Chevrolet's exit from U.S. manufacturing wasn't just a ripple, it was a tsunami. Over $48.1 billion in vehicle production had been frozen or eliminated. That figure wasn't just symbolic. It represented a massive logistical and economic disruption across the country. The vehicles impacted were not niche products. These were Chevrolet's core offerings, the lifeblood of its domestic portfolio. The Silverado 1500, a mainstay of American pickup culture. The Tahoe and Suburban, beloved by families and fleets alike. The Blazer, Equinox, and the all-electric Bolt, each representing Chevrolet's vision for the future. All shut down, all gone quiet. In practical terms, this meant thousands of dealerships across the country suddenly found themselves in chaos. Stop sale notices were sent out without explanation. Fleet managers, especially those managing government contracts, were told their deliveries were delayed indefinitely. Dealership websites continued to show build and price options for vehicles no longer in production. Customers placed orders for cars that would never arrive. Internally, General Motors labeled the move a strategic realignment. But to dealers, suppliers, and customers, it felt like a betrayal. It was like someone turned off the tap overnight, said a Chevy dealer in Pennsylvania. No warning, no stock, no answers. Worse still were the ripple effects. Parts suppliers who relied on Chevy contracts began shuttering operations. Warehouse and logistics companies slashed jobs. Some smaller firms, whose entire business models were built around GM's supply chain, went under in weeks. The domino effect extended far beyond the 17,000 workers at the plants. Industry economists estimate that over 100,000 ancillary jobs, from parts manufacturers to transportation contractors, are now at risk due to Chevrolet's departure. And for many of those companies, recovery is not guaranteed. Meanwhile, the financial world interpreted the move very differently. Analysts applauded GM's discipline. Investors hailed the retreat as prudent margin protection. But to the towns and families whose livelihoods evaporated overnight, it was a gut punch. Even customers felt the shift. One suburban dad in Georgia, who had placed a deposit on a Bolt EV for his daughter's graduation, told reporters, "They just stopped answering our calls. We walked into the dealership and the car wasn't coming anymore. No refund, no update." That was the hidden cost, not just the economic numbers, but the erosion of trust. Trust between brand and buyer, between worker and employer, between company and country. Chevrolet didn't just walk away from production, it walked away from a legacy. And as that $48 billion disappears from American factory floors, the real question becomes, what else disappears with it? The moment news of Chevrolet's production freeze reached the national stage, Washington lit up like a fuse had been lit. What had begun as a silent retreat in factory towns exploded into a political inferno that neither General Motors nor the federal government could contain. President Donald Trump was first to address the issue, standing before a podium lined with American flags, defending the very policy that had triggered the shutdown. "This isn't a punishment, he stated firmly. "This is a correction. For decades, we've let our industries bleed jobs overseas. No more. It's time to bring the factories home where they belong." But for workers in Michigan, Missouri, and Texas, the ones who had just lost their livelihoods, those words felt hollow. In cities like Flint and Toledo, the promise of revived American manufacturing had turned into joblessness. What was supposed to be a revival now looked like ruin. State and local leaders didn't mince words. Several governors, including those from Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, co-signed an emergency resolution demanding immediate federal exemptions for domestic auto parts tied to U.S. assembly plants. "This is not the reset we were promised," said one state senator. "This is economic devastation wrapped in red, white, and blue." Capitol Hill responded with urgency. Senate hearings were called within days. The CEOs of General Motors and Chevrolet were subpoenaed, their teams grilled by bipartisan panels demanding answers. Economic experts testified that if similar companies followed suit, the cascading effect on American industry could result in a $100 billion blow to GDP over the next 2 years. Yet even amid outrage, no consensus could be found. Democratic lawmakers pushed for immediate relief programs for displaced workers and tax incentives to rebuild domestic supply chains. Republicans, on the other hand, doubled down on the tariffs, insisting that short-term pain was necessary for long-term sovereignty. Meanwhile, GM lobbyists worked overtime behind closed doors, desperately trying to prevent new legislation from targeting their remaining operations. In off-the-record briefings, they warned lawmakers that pushing too hard could result in the full collapse of GM's domestic footprint, including the shuttering of future electric vehicle initiatives tied to federal fleet contracts. Caught in the middle were the people, those who built the trucks, balanced the books, stocked the shelves, and trusted that their decades of loyalty would be rewarded. Now, they were watching their futures turn into a political football. Protests erupted outside state houses and city halls. In some towns, marches were led by factory workers still wearing their Chevrolet uniforms, holding up signs that read, "We built this brand," and "America Last." The message was clear. They didn't feel like this was protectionism. They felt abandoned. And as Washington turned the issue into a battle of ideologies, those on the ground couldn't afford to wait for a legislative miracle. Mortgage payments were due. Kids still needed health care. Entire local economies were now teetering on the edge. This wasn't just a policy disagreement anymore. It was a war over what the future of American labor should look like. Was it one rooted in global competitiveness and lean supply chains, or one that put national interest and job stability first? No one had an answer. But one thing was clear. Chevrolet's move had pulled back the curtain on the fragile balance between free market capitalism and national responsibility. And the backlash was only beginning. Chevrolet's shutdown may have started in corporate boardrooms, but the aftershocks hit hardest on the streets of working-class America. In places like Janesville, Wisconsin, Flint, Michigan, and Westville, Missouri, the silence left behind by the assembly lines was more than eerie. It was devastating. In Janesville, a diner across from the now-closed Chevy plant used to open its doors at 5 a.m. sharp, serving coffee and eggs to the first shift crowd. Today it opens at 9 and closes before lunch. "Half my regulars are out of work," the waitress said. "The other half are scared they're next." In Flint, the story is even grimmer. Mortgage payments are going unpaid. Trucks are sitting unsold on gravel lots. Grocery stores are slashing hours. A city once known for its resilience is now grappling with a crisis that feels familiar and worse. "We've been through plant closures before," said a retired foreman, "but this one feels different, like a final goodbye." Toledo tells a similar story. Local high schools used to hold career days where students would meet line workers from the Chevrolet plant, people with steady jobs, pensions, and pride in what they built. Now, Those same students are being told to look elsewhere. "We used to tell our kids to stay local," said one parent. "Now we're telling them to leave." The collapse isn't just economic, it's psychological. For many families, Chevrolet wasn't just a brand, it was a generational identity. Fathers worked the line, then watched their sons and daughters take their place. It wasn't just a paycheck, it was a badge of honor. And now, that legacy is crumbling. Entire communities are being hollowed out. School boards are holding emergency budget meetings as tax revenue dries up. Real estate prices are plummeting. Local charities are overwhelmed by sudden surges in food assistance applications. One former plant worker in Missouri summed it up. "We gave everything to that job, and now it's gone, just like that. No warning, no thank you, just silence." And the pain isn't isolated. With over 17,000 direct jobs gone and more than 100,000 indirectly affected, the collapse is national in scale, but deeply personal in impact. It's not just the job losses, it's the unraveling of stability, the erosion of hope. The federal safety nets, already stretched thin, aren't enough. And corporate promises of retraining programs and relocation packages sound increasingly hollow to workers who've already been burned. In many of these towns, the Chevrolet plant was the heartbeat. Now it's a ghost. Local leaders are scrambling to attract new employers, but it's a hard sell. Infrastructure was built around those plants. Roads, schools, shops, they all relied on the rhythm of the factory whistle. Now there's only quiet. What's happening isn't just economic decline. It's blue-collar collapse, a slow-motion shattering of the middle-class dream that generations worked to build. And as that dream fades, it's being replaced with something darker: resentment, frustration, and a growing sense that the system doesn't work for them anymore. While American workers were losing jobs and towns were entering economic freefall, something very different was happening just across the border. In Mexico, the lights were turning on, conveyor belts were humming, and Chevrolet's most iconic vehicles were rolling off new assembly lines, just not on American soil. What began as a quiet cost-cutting memo inside General Motors' Detroit headquarters had evolved into a sweeping international relocation strategy. The Silverado, the Blazer, even the Bolt EV. All were being shifted to new plants in Mexico and South Korea, far from the towns that once called them their own. This wasn't temporary. It was structural. Internal documents revealed that GM executives had long weighed the benefits of offshore labor. And in the wake of America's 25% tariff shockwave, the decision became clear. Mexico offered a 70% labor cost advantage. South Korea offered high-tech infrastructure with minimal union resistance. In both countries, government incentives sweetened the deal even further. American union workers demanded fair wages, health care, and retirement. Their counterparts in Mexico paid a fraction, often non-union, and with little power to protest. For GM, the math was impossible to ignore. In a closed-door investor call, one board member was blunt. "We didn't leave America. America priced us out." The post-NAFTA trade environment made the transition even smoother. Cross-border rail links, tax breaks, streamlined logistics hubs. In many cases, it was now faster and cheaper to build a truck in Mexico and ship it to Texas than it was to build the same truck in Ohio and drive it across the state. Publicly, General Motors painted the decision as one of survival. "We remain committed to American consumers," read one statement. "This move ensures we stay competitive in a global market." But privately, the tone was far more clinical. Leaked emails referred to the U.S. operations as cost inefficient and non-essential under current conditions. The truth is, this wasn't just about staying afloat. It was about protecting profits. GM stock rose 8% the day after the shift was announced. Investors applauded the move as a sign of executive discipline. Financial headlines labeled it a smart pivot. But for the American towns left behind, it felt more like a corporate betrayal. And the vehicles themselves? They still carry the Chevrolet name, still sold under the red, white, and blue banner. But now, many of them are made thousands of miles away by workers who've never set foot in the country where these vehicles built their legacy. This is the paradox of globalization. The same free market that allows GM to optimize costs is the one that leaves American workers jobless. It's a system where shareholder value trumps community loyalty, where efficiency outweighs history. And it leaves one glaring question hanging in the air. If American brands no longer build in America, what does that brand even stand for anymore? While factory lights dimmed and communities braced for collapse, Wall Street lit up with applause. The same day General Motors confirmed the $48 billion shutdown in U.S. Chevrolet production, its stock surged by over 8%. Financial analysts and investment forums erupted with praise for what they dubbed a bold restructuring decision. In the eyes of corporate America, GM had made the smart move. The numbers told a story of strategic brilliance. Analysts projected that relocating production to Mexico and South Korea could yield over $3 billion in savings over the next 5 years. Cost reductions from cheaper labor, tax incentives from foreign governments, and increased automation would all contribute to leaner operations and stronger margins. For investors, this wasn't a crisis, it was a celebration. Financial media spun the narrative. Chevy's pain is GM's gain, read one headline. General Motors shows discipline in shifting global strategy, declared another. Institutional shareholders praised CEO Mary Barra for steering the company through inflationary pressures and regulatory headwinds with clarity and courage. Quarterly earnings projections were updated. Price targets were raised. But while brokers and boardrooms cheered, Main Street was crumbling. In Flint, Michigan, real estate agents reported an abrupt slowdown. Families put homes on the market as job losses mounted, but few buyers remained. In Westville, Missouri, a local hospital announced it would delay renovation plans due to a sharp drop in tax revenue. School districts across factory towns convened emergency meetings, bracing for cuts to programs and staff. The disconnect was stark. On one side, a soaring stock chart. On the other, a collapsing social safety net. For the people who once built the very vehicles now being shipped offshore, the celebration felt grotesque. "How can they call this a win?" asked a laid-off worker from the Arlington plant. "My kids just lost their health insurance, but some hedge fund is toasting champagne because they saved on labor." And this wasn't isolated outrage, it was spreading. Across working-class towns, anger grew not just at Chevrolet, but at a system that seemed to reward destruction, a system where the closure of a factory could mean a spike in a company's stock price, a system where shareholder value was elevated above human value. This was the modern paradox of American capitalism. A corporation could devastate the very towns it once built and still be rewarded handsomely for doing so. Some economists defended GM's move as necessary evolution. "These companies don't exist to employ people," one financial commentator said on a national television. "They exist to return value to their shareholders." It was a cold truth, but one that cut deep for communities whose lives had been tied to these companies for generations. This stark divergence between Wall Street and Main Street wasn't new, but Chevrolet's shutdown brought it into razor-sharp focus. It wasn't just about economics anymore. It was about justice, about who benefits when corporations pivot and who gets left behind. In this new era of efficiency, thousands of American workers had become a line item, a cost to be eliminated. And while the balance sheets improved, the soul of the brand and the trust of the people who built it took a hit that may never be repaired. Because when profits rise at the same time communities fall, the system may be working, but it's not working for everyone. The first spark came from a single phone camera. A veteran in Kentucky, standing beside his Chevrolet Silverado, recorded a brief, emotionally charged message. Dressed in his military jacket and holding his keys, he looked straight into the lens. "I bought this truck because it was American," he said, "because I believed in what this company stood for, but Chevrolet doesn't believe in us anymore." He handed his keys back to the dealership and walked away. That video went viral within hours. It didn't take long for others to follow. Across the country, Chevrolet customers began recording their own videos. Families, truck owners, small business operators. Some filmed themselves returning vehicles. Others canceled fleet contracts. A few simply stood in silence beside their trucks, leaving handwritten notes taped to windshields with one message repeated in different forms: no longer loyal. The movement was spontaneous. No union had called for it. No political campaign had coordinated it. It was raw and organic, a wave of disillusionment from people who felt that Chevrolet had turned its back on them. It wasn't long before influential voices online started weighing in. Popular auto YouTubers, former GM loyalists, and veteran communities started releasing statements, reaction videos, and open letters. One podcast host summed it up bluntly: "This isn't about a truck, it's about a betrayal. We backed into next Chevy during the bailouts, during the rough years. Now they're cashing out and shipping off." Chevrolet's $48 billion shutdown wasn't just about cost cutting or supply chains. It was a turning point, a mirror held up to the state of American industry, showing us what happens when globalization, corporate strategy, and national policy collide without a safety net. Factories went silent. Workers were blindsided. Towns built on decades of loyalty were left without purpose. And all the while, stock prices climbed and production resumed, not here, but overseas. This wasn't a slow decline. It was a strategic retreat, carried out with precision and silence. And now, as the dust settles, we're left with questions no brand statement can answer. Can a company still call itself American if it abandons the people who made it that way? Can a brand built on loyalty survive after it's fractured the trust it took generations to earn? And more urgently, who's next? This story wasn't just about Chevrolet. It's about what we value as a country, about whether communities still matter in the corporate equation, and about whether American industry is entering a new chapter or nearing its final pages. So now it's your turn. Has your town been affected by this shift? Has your trust in the American auto industry changed? Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between. I'd love to hear it.